Good afternoon. I'm Chris Cardona, Senior Program Officer for Philanthropy at the Ford Foundation. Welcome to today's virtual program with Inforum at the Commonwealth Club. I'm excited to be in conversation with today's guests, Diana Campoamor, who is the founder of Nuestra America Fund and editor of If We Want to Win, a Latina vision for a new American democracy, which came out just yesterday. Congratulations. And we have two of the contributors to the volume, Ana Maria Archilagos, who's the president and CEO of Hispanics in Philanthropy, and Alexandra Aquino Fike, who's most recently, as of just last week, Vice President of Development at the East Bay Community Foundation, and is currently the board chair of the Mauricio Aquino Foundation. Have you ever seen so many Latina philanthropists in one place? Goodness me. So Latina people make up the second largest ethnic and racial group in America, with a population of more than 60 million, according to the latest census. We've been integral to shaping the country's economy, culture, and politics, yet our diversity within our community remains misunderstood, our contributions are often ignored, and our concerns are often overlooked. Today, we'll be addressing what it means to be Latina, including why that term relative to some others you may have heard, and we'll sketch out a blueprint for a more inclusive and just democracy during these politically divisive times. Before we start, I'd like to remind our audience to submit their questions in the YouTube chat or the comments section. We'll try to get through as many of them as possible toward the end of this slightly more than an hour-long program. So let's get started. Diana, one thing I was surprised to learn from the introduction to the book is that the term United States of America, the of America part, is a relatively recent vintage. Tell us about the word America and what it means to you, and the vision that you have for a new American democracy.
Right. Thank you, Chris, and thank you to my colleagues at the Commonwealth Club, to Ana Mari, to Alex. As you know, Chris, our anthology is really a group effort, a quilt of many, many American stories. And to answer your question, we use America as in the, exchangeable with the United States. But the term America actually was not used in the 19th century. It began to be used in the 20th century. In the 19th century, we referred to ourselves as the Union or the Republic. But as Theodore Roosevelt was part of the Spanish-American War, and as the country tried to acquire, other territories, there was an imperial vision that all of us, meaning the United States and its territories, that we were America. And the reason I start with that in my preface is because I came here as a child. I was 11 years old. I was coming from Cuba. My parents were political refugees. And when I arrived, I was surprised that immediately I was told that I was not an American. In my definition, Cuba was in the Americas, and I was an American, although maybe not an American from the United States. And so my point is that our vision for the future needs to be inclusive, not only inclusive of Latinos who live in the United States, and in some cases have lived for generations and generations, but also of everyone else who is in the continent of the Americas, North and South.
That's a compelling vision, and it really makes me think differently about using that term America. I think of my relatives in Colombia who would say, no, you're norteamericano, and I would say, soy americano, no, you're norteamericano. Or the term estadounidense, right? Like someone from the United States, but rather than American. Speaking of terms, could you unpack a little bit why you all opted to use Latina in the title of the book as opposed to Latinx or Latino or Hispanic or any other term? Why that choice? I assume it was intentional.
Absolutely, and thank you for asking that question. I think the main thing is all the terms are fine. People should be able to use the term that they identify with. And in our book, we use all of them. We use Hispanic, we use Latino, we use Latinx, we use Latine. Our team chose Latine because it is number one, gender neutral. And number two, it is a reference to a movement in the Spanish language, which is a language that many of us speak in addition to English, to, turn the language gender neutral. And so it was a tip of the hat. And we also believe that, these terms continue to change. And we believe that this is the term that will be in use in the next 2 or 3 years because of that reason. But again, this is not to say this is the term. No,
Yeah.
they're all terms that describe our communities because, in fact, we're a very diverse community, and different groups use different identities.
Yeah, I'm increasingly starting to think of it like gender pronouns, right? It's just a courtesy to ask, what do you use? And different ones of us will have different preferences as you talk about. Alex, turning to you for a moment. One of the challenges with the prevailing narrative about Latina folks is that it's so often only about need and about lack, right? In your chapter, which is about a transnational movement to learn the fates of the disappeared from El Salvador's civil war in the 1980s, you write really movingly about both trauma and privilege, right? Sort of those two things alongside each other. What has the relationship between trauma and privilege looked like in your own advocacy?
Thanks, Chris. It's a great question, and I'm honored to be part of this panel and honored to be part of this book. As you can see in the article, I did do a lot of personal exploration, and that connection between trauma and privilege kind of came out for me in the process of writing. So, when Deanna asked me to participate in this anthology, I definitely focused on the personal odyssey of my family. So, if you read the article, you can see that my own father, Mauricio Aquino Chacon, was disappeared when I was a baby. I was born in El Salvador. My parents were activists in the left-wing student movement, and because of his own beliefs and his desire to fight for a stronger democracy and human rights, he was forcibly taken from our home, and we never got any official notice. We never, received his remains. But it really, as my family has grappled with that trauma, it really became clear to me that we're one of, if you can say lucky, we're definitely one of the more privileged families in that we had more access to official channels to file grievances. We had more access to information. And we had access, ultimately, we realized, to this very transnational, international set of actors. So once I really kind of decided to own that privilege, being bilingual, having dual nationality, being an attorney, it really gave me the strength to try to organize other young people. I didn't realize until I was an adult that over 10,000 Salvadorans were disappeared during the armed conflict. And it is actually an international human rights abuse under UN conventions. Other countries in the world have been much better at really grappling with these kinds of post-war traumas. But I think El Salvador, and I would argue, and I try to argue this in my article, that much of Latin America hasn't really dealt with the trauma in our region, going all the way back to the Conquista era. But almost every country in Latin America has had some kind of armed conflict or revolution. And it really goes deep to the roots of disparity and inequity in our region. And I think if we do, for those of us who live in the US, if we really do want a strong democracy across Latin America, then all of us, from philanthropists to government agencies, those with power and privilege, we really do need to be investing in strengthening democracy and human rights in our region. And until we do that, then you're going to be seeing repeats of human rights abuses and weakening of democracy, which is happening again in El Salvador as we speak. The current president and the administration have basically thrown out their version of the Supreme Court. They have installed new favorable judges who have basically allowed the current president to keep running as much as he wants. He's called himself the coolest dictator in the world on social media, and already started to disband or weaken critical, democratic institutions. So I'm quite concerned for the fate of El Salvador. But it's not just El Salvador. We're seeing this trend across Central America and across South America. So my hope is that my article gives activists like me kind of lessons and courage to perhaps organize, even though we're dealing with decades old trauma.
Yeah. And let's dig into that advice to activists a little bit, because there was one line that you wrote that really stayed with me, among others. You said, facing privilege is critical to building lasting trust and a stable coalition. That sounds like come from some hard-won experience. How's that played out in practice in your advocacy? And thinking about folks in our audience, privileged people in our audience, how might privileged folks use that that learning in service of solidarity, use that privilege in service of solidarity?
Yeah, I think anyone who cares about Latin America, and if you're based in the US, the first step is to realize that you're part of an ecosystem of human rights defenders, democracy defenders, and there is most likely a whole ecosystem of NGO human rights leaders in the countries of origin. So in my case, in El Salvador, that has a rich history. And I can't support democracy in El Salvador without really leaning into those leaders and listening to them, following their lead when it comes to taking strategic actions in El Salvador. But it also means that I need to own my access to political power here in the US, which, as we know, is the biggest investor in these countries and democratic institutions and their military aid and development aid. So we, as US citizens, Latinos in the US, we have huge privilege and power. If we can influence the Biden administration or folks at USAID or the State Department, we have serious power, and we can perhaps cause change in the governments of El Salvador or other countries. And we've already seen that with our campaign play out. If not for our organizing around, a few years ago with the Obama administration, then we probably wouldn't have gotten the then president of El Salvador, Salvador Sanchez Cerén, to actually open an official entity that is charged with investigating the disappeared. And I really do think that's because of the US influence. And then now you're seeing, the USAID, because of the pressure of activists in El Salvador and here, they've cut significantly aid to El Salvador until the Bukele administration reaffirms its commitment to human rights. So that's just a small example, but I think it could be a model of how you influence both from the US, but also from El Salvador or Latin America.
Yeah, no, and that transnational reality of our communities is a thing, Diana, I know that you've been writing and working on for a long time. So it's amazing to see that concrete example in practice of and how that change can happen. And it's such a resonant thing that you say for people to understand that they're part of an ecosystem of human rights defenders. One of the things that nourishes that ecosystem is private philanthropy, right? So turning now to Ana Mari, from your perch at Hispanics in Philanthropy, you write about a vision for what philanthropy can be, to deploy capital for change and to build our power. But we're not there yet, right? What changes are needed in philanthropy and in our own communities for that vision to come about?
Thanks, Chris, and thank you for Diana to getting this book. I'm so excited to see it in person, and we should all have our own copies. I love where Alex left us. Yes, we have the power, but I don't think that we see ourselves as philanthropists yet. When I first took this job, I talked to my daughter, to my mom, and I'm like, "You're a philanthropist." They're like, "No." And I'm like, "Mommy, see, you're, sending remesas, remittances, or you're, giving $25 to United Way, or you're giving money. We're all philanthropists." So I think that first we need a paradigm shift in terms of who sees themselves as a philanthropist. And so that our community, which is extremely generous, and there's very, very few studies, but the few studies that have studied philanthropy in our community, underscores that the Latino community is very generous. but our giving looks a little bit different. And so being able to study that and being able to own these studies so that it's in the public narrative, the generosity of our folks, I think that's really important, because that then places us as givers, right? Which we are. And that then has influence when you start aggregating it. And it also is really fantastic to be able to add different, I call them pipes and channels, but different ways of giving. I mean, I'm a fan of community foundations, that's great, but there's so many other ways of giving right there in California where, you know, we're being beamed into. You have the Latino Community Fund, which is doing fantastic work across California with giving circles. And like with the work that they're doing, like multiply that hundreds of times. We need to shift first then the public narrative and who owns like this title of philanthropist. Another thing that needs to shift is like what traditional foundation philanthropy looks like, because over 45 years that this has been studied by one of our founders, he's the first one that did it 45 years ago, Herman Gallegos, and it was 1% of foundation giving, institutional funders, right, was going to the Latino community, Latino led, Latino serving. That 1% number has not changed. It's gone up to 1.02 and it's gone down to 0.6, but basically it's never gone over 1.02. And think about the Latino community 45 years ago, much smaller than we are now. And think about it when we're, you know, by 2030 and what's going to happen by 2050. If that 1% number sticks, as it's stuck for the past 2 generations, we're in big trouble, because it's a whole segment of our population that is not being invested in. And yes, this is the dollars that are flexible dollars that pay for the human rights defenders, pays for after school, pays for so many other things. And so I feel like we're in a crisis moment, and it's been a persistent challenge, but now it's going to really raise in terms of how we address it. It's not a nice thing to address. It's an urgent thing to address.
Yeah. And I want to unpack something that you talked about in the recap of those statistics, which are indeed alarming, about Latino led. And you know, sometimes there's pushback on these studies about like, oh, we support, you know, the Boyle Heights community in Los Angeles. We don't say it's targeted to Latinos, but it's mostly Latinos who live there. So isn't that the same thing? Is it the same thing, or what's the difference when you support Latino-led organizations specifically? And why is that important?
You know, the studies are the way people code things, and then Candid picks it up and reports back on it. It's not a perfect science. But when you look at this latinxfunders.org, which is a dashboard that is tracking everything, it's been tracking it since 2013. And before that, we have hard copies, which Diana, my predecessor at Hispanics in Philanthropy, was always fantastic to push on. You can see, like in the top 20, most of them are not Latino-led organizations. You have wonderful organizations like Climate Works or like Aspire Schools and things like that, but there's a difference. There's a sovereignty issue, right? I'm married to a Navajo guy, so the word sovereignty, it means something to me. And you really do need, in that C-suite, the people making decisions have to like, it's by, for, and about. And not to segregate, but folks that have the lived experience of our communities, you can't get around that. You need to have folks that are have understood. Granted, Latinos, you know, we're not a race, we're an ethnicity. A lot of people say, oh, you can be Latino by corazón, by heart. It's an affinity. But you do need to have people leading organizations that have that lived experience of our community. And so, yeah, I don't buy it. I feel like there needs to be more rigor in how those things are reported on and counted.
Yeah, with the real focus on what Latino leadership looks like within those and the difference that it makes. No, that's compelling.
Absolutely.
Diana, you know, and actually for all of you really, we're just, you know, an election day was yesterday, and And as usual, folks are parsing through all of the different returns and making sense of it. And I think back to a year ago, and one of the things that people were parsing through was the proportion of Latinos who voted for Trump. And there were reports that found that surprising. Were you surprised by that?
Yes, I was surprised, but there are explanations. No community is monolithic, no community is homogeneous. And I believe that in certain states, Texas and Florida in particular, there were issues that resonated with some Latino voters that in the past had voted Democratic. Now, let's keep in mind, that more than 60% of the Latino vote is Democratic. And that number has only grown election by election. That being said, I think, when a party decides to focus on one state, perhaps Pennsylvania or Arizona, at the risk of losing another state like Texas or Florida, what that means is that it gives the other party an opening. And I think that's what happened in 2020. There were foreign policy issues like Venezuela and Cuba that played into the Republican hand. But you're never going to have 100% of Latinos be a part of one party or the other, and I think that's a good thing. There are the important thing for both parties to remember is, last year in 2020, more than 50% of Latino eligible voters voted. We were 1 in every 10 voter, and that number is only growing. In places like Arizona, for example, our vote went from about 44% to over 60%. Those are important numbers. And, our book is called If We Want to Win, and I think it's a reference, of course, to elections. It's more a reference, to a broader concept of winning because we all win, right? But if we want to win in 22 and in 24, we need to be making long-term investments. We need to be thinking about, all the Latino voters that are turning 18 this year and next year and the year after that, because we're a very young population. So narrative is part of making that case. And, our book talks about the power of narrative, the power of Ana Mari's story, the power of Alex's story, the power of all of us messaging why democracy in this country is important. And it's also important in our countries of origin, where our diaspora communities, whether we're Cuban or Mexican or Salvadorian, where we can play a role in those democracies, because in fact, many of us are sending home remittances, many of us have family, and democracy is not just about the US, although that's very important because we're all US Americans, but it's also very important in our countries of origin. And, and if we have one thing to export, it's that democracy. And Latinos are a natural civic, citizen diplomats and citizen activists in the support of those democracies in our countries.
And that really ties back to the example that Alex was sharing, right? Of that kind of activism transnationally in the US and back in El Salvador in your case. And you alluded to this, Alex, but about sort of what the latest is with regard to that activism, right? In the chapter, it's sort of, it narrates, an administration here, an administration there are more or less favorable. And, as a reader, I was left hanging. Around the time of publication, the Biden administration was coming into power. And you alluded to some of this, but for those of us who want to, be up on the latest on what the what that ongoing search is to understand the fates of the disappeared and begin healing in the ways that you talked about. As an example of that, further example of that transnational advocacy that Diana talked about, what's the latest? What should we know?
El Salvador, as I mentioned earlier, is in a very delicate, I would say, at-risk position right now. So the population is starting to realize that the person they elected, President Bukele, may actually not be in favor of a true democracy. And so you're seeing a rapid increase in public protests across the country, with the first one in September, and then 2 weeks ago they had the second one. A lot of it at first on the surface was around the adoption of Bitcoin as an official currency. But really, the protests quickly, if you read the news or if you dug deeper into the articles, people are very scared about the administration coming after activists, and they already have. They've incarcerated or they've issued arrest warrants for political leaders, for human rights activists. The State Department is saying that they're concerned. But I think, what's giving me courage is that Salvadorans are coming together and they are protesting publicly, even though there's probably risk to them. And you're seeing Salvadorans here in the US, we're trying to organize ourselves on social media, actually, to really do kind of a digital form of protest, because for better or worse, Bukele is very influenced by social media. And that's one of his Achilles heels. Really sending him messages or protesting on Twitter, for example, does seem to get reactions. But really, the next step is, I think, at least for our campaign, we are definitely focusing on influencing and around strategic actions with influencing the Biden administration. So we're going to be organizing probably a visit to DC in the next 6 months. We're going to be organizing letters and calls to influential Congress people. But that's probably our best lever at this point. And I would argue for most of Latin America right now, given the current regimes, as our best chance is to organize and flex our democratic voice here in the US. We owe it to our brothers and sisters in Latin America. I think that is a big part of what makes, as Ana Maria and Diana have mentioned, that is at the core, at the heart of our identity as Latina, Latinx. We have these incredibly strong roots, whether you're first generation, second generation. I think that is a through line in our culture that whether you speak Spanish or not, your family definitely passes down those stories. And we also pass down the intergenerational trauma. And I think if we can invest, those of us in philanthropy or in government, if we can invest now more than ever in providing the right support to Latina leaders, to our communities, then we can really activate their civic engagement and influence policies here in the US and in Latin America. And I would also argue that, the powers that be in the Democratic and Republican parties are missing the mark in investing, especially in progressive young Latino leaders. Arizona, for me, is the case example of what could happen across the country if we invest in that way and if we hold up those leaders in that way. It's remarkable what they did, and it wasn't just this one election. They have been those grassroots leaders have been organizing for decades, and 2020 was the culmination of all of that grassroots organizing. And I think we owe it to, if we want to see bigger change across our country and in Latin America, those are the leaders we need to be investing in. So my hope is that 2022 won't be as scary, but we need to do the right kinds of investments.
Right. And there's so much that can be done within the frameworks of 501c3 funding, which is about voter education, turnout, but nonpartisan in the way that it's done. And there's a lot of education of lawmakers that can happen through that as well, which is important to note. So Ana Maria, as you listen to what Alex is saying about those different forms of advocacy and what's needed, both in the U.S. and in Latin America, and you think about the range of tools that fit under broad umbrella of philanthropy, what are some of the things that you're, especially excited about, or that might be able to respond to that call for supporting youth leadership in the way that Alex is talking about?
Well, I think it's first and foremost important for funders, whether that be institutional funders or individual funders. More and more, it's individual funders that are making the difference. And so when I talk about funders, I'm doing shorthand about folks that are giving small dollars, big dollars, and it's individuals and institutions. Something that Liana said was very important, deserves a underscore, and that's about our identity, that we are not a monolith. Most of us do self-identify countries of origin. And so that's very complicated to understand, because there's, 60 million of us, and we, you can be fully Colombian, you can be half Cuban, half Puerto Rican like me, right? And how do you develop a program or initiatives that are going to be inclusive and taking into consideration this is such a broad community? And so I think the first thing is really trying to understand, and that takes deep understanding, is not superficial understanding. So we really need to, by having one program officer or like having somebody come and doing a DEI training is not going to cut it. You really need to make a commitment to understand what is this community, what are the issues, and that is going to really be different depending on geography and so many other things. Until we do that, this is going to persist. I think two other things that I would think about is who's actually the decision maker. We have studies that are happening every 2 years looking at who works in philanthropy, and the numbers are increasing a little bit when you get to like the program officer level. But when you look at the C-suite level, you don't have that. And the numbers are even worse at the trustee level. So who's representing and who's developing the high level strategy? It's not trustees that, again, I talked about it earlier, that have the lived experience. This is not something that's just nice to do. These organizations, foundations, given that they're working to improve opportunities, improve what this country looks like and how we're experiencing the country, whether they're working on environment or education or health or what be it, we don't have folks that are representing the community, they're not going to get to mission. The third thing that I'll mention is my good friend Lori Villarosa just came out with a report that I love. She heads the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity, PRE, and it's called Mismatched. So I think a lot of what I'm talking about is mismatches in different spaces, but Lori's report about mismatch also looks at accountability. And so accountability with trustees and who works for you is important. Accountability as to where the money is going. I talked about Candid earlier. Candid is the organization, and with just to make sure everyone knows, I'm on the board. I love Candid, an amazing organization, and they're tracking and counting what philanthropy, who's giving it, where it's going. After the murder of George Floyd, there was a flurry of commitments, of pledges, and they counted those. And they counted $8.8 billion. There were other reports. I know that Bridgespan and PolicyLink did one report, and they counted 11.9 billion with a B dollars in pledges for racial equity, racial justice. This is astounding. Candid did it, and when Candid took out the double counting, it was down to 8.8 billion. So the number starts going down. When PRE did the counting and like what monies actually were committed for the Latino-led, Latino-serving organizations, and that wasn't for, they took out all of the internal DEI-focused stuff that that were counted in the pledges. That number went down to, drumroll, 3.4 billion. And a lot of those dollars still have not made it to exactly to the communities to which they were promised. So I think that we have to get a lot better at demanding accountability and not letting people get away with these fake pledges and commitments. Because if you look at these numbers, you think that everything's okay and that money's flowing to solve these problems in a collective way, but it's not. That's a farce.
So that accountability and that transparency, they go together, and there's a role for all of us to call for that greater accountability.
Exactly.
Dan, I can't help but think, but this is something that you've seen over the years in your time leading Hispanics in philanthropy. I guess this is really a question for all of you all. In different ways, each of us has been working for years to understand and reverse that institutional disinvestment in Latino communities. What's behind it at the end of the day? Why does it persist? Why do those numbers continue to be so low? Talked about lack of representation. That's part of it. What else?
So if I can jump in, I think these are structural issues, okay? Much in the way, that foundations, work, and individual donors, work with certain lawyers and certain organizations. But this is what I would say, okay? If I was Jeff Bezos and my father was Miguel Bezos from Santiago de Cuba, I would be putting $1 billion into Hispanics in philanthropy right now. You know why? Because it's the best investment that you can make. If I was Tom Steyer, if I was the Sandler family, if I was all of those, important individual donors, I would be putting my money there because this is where the vote is going. This is what our economic prosperity depends in. This is what our cultural vibrance depends in. And I think this decade is important beyond measure. I think in this decade, we become the prosperous, democratic, pluralistic society that we can be, or we fall back. We fall back and we surrender the leadership that we have had in the world and in climate change and in all of the other areas. So I think, philanthropy it's not just about, giving away, tax sheltered dollars. It's about intention. And so I would say to all of those large donors, you have an opportunity to reverse that and, to reverse a, 40 years of underfunding. You have an opportunity to influence the vote, to influence, our policy towards countries in Latin America that are important trading partners. You have an opportunity to touch the people that are most impacted by climate change and who are the next generation of leaders in the climate change, area. So, I think there's no question about it. It's a matter of making good investments. It's not about liking this group versus that group.
Yeah.
I think, if you're listening to me, Miguel Bezos and Jeff Bezos, let's all run to HIP and to the Mauricio Aquino Foundation and to a number of other, organizations that are doing the infrastructure work. Let's remember that the African-American community had an infrastructure of civil rights organizations, of public interest groups, of sororities and fraternities, and that supported by many partners and allies who were not African Americans is what changed the laws in this country. I mean, it is in my lifetime. When I arrived in New Orleans in 1960, Black people were at the back of the bus and my elementary school was segregated. This is what our country was. We need to move forward. And one way to move forward is by making these investments and making these investments for the long run.
Well said. Alex, I'm curious, you're coming out of an experience of working at the East Bay Community Foundation, where that was a community foundation of the type that Anna Maria referenced earlier that is taking on this challenge, right, of engaging individual donors, engaging wealthy donors in the East Bay in a more direct way to talk about racial equity and the need for this type of uplifting narrative that Deanna's laying out. What did you, recognizing that you left your post there last week and we'll soon be on to the next thing, but just curious if you have any early reflections about what that experience has been like, to engage with donors, particularly, in giving to a predominantly African-American city like Oakland.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely reflecting on that. I'm incredibly grateful for my 5 years at the East Bay Community Foundation, and to James Head, also the CEO and president, who also recently stepped down. I think what EBCF got right and can be a model for other philanthropic institutions is going in the vein of what we were talking about earlier, who we hired. So James Head was very intentional about creating a senior team, a C-suite full of people of color, people with lived experiences who came from certain communities that have been historically marginalized in the East Bay, and who had, the experience and the chops to think about a vision of a more just region. Our tagline was a just East Bay. And we also, as part of that, hiring, we also hired grassroots organizers. As our programs team was completely re-envisioned, and we hired folks who had done grassroots campaign work or grassroots community organizing for decades, who came from historically marginalized communities as well. And so suddenly you saw a foundation put together a new mission statement that put racial equity at its core. We completely redid our discretionary grant making so that we were dedicating all of it to primarily BIPOC organizations who really had a strong understanding at the intersection of direct service and long-term systems change. And in terms of engaging with donors, we completely remade our team as well, so that we brought on folks who had an appetite or experience with viewing donors not just as checkbooks, but as full political allies, potential political allies. And so part of the work that I think all of us in philanthropy have in front of us is to keep engaging, re-engaging, and really follow through with commitments around equity, but in particular racial equity. And that means, internal, who you hire, who you put on your board, but also what programs you fund, and really understanding that if we are going to make a dent in some of these, challenging issues that we're facing across the country and Latin America, then it's not just about direct service. You really have to be courageous enough to invest in political advocacy, policy change, long-term systems change, and that there's leaders out there who have been doing this. There's organizations that HIP knows, there's organizations that all of our foundations know, who are at the front lines right now doing that grassroots organizing around different policy measures, and they're just not getting the funding that they need. And going back to your original question, Chris, I do think it is partly, and maybe in large part, due to the ongoing effects of white supremacy in this country, how this country was built, who's in power, political power, and it is still a largely white male field. And until we really grapple with that history, and not in a way necessarily to make people, go after people personally, but we all have a lot of healing work, a lot of trauma to really deal with. Even those of us who are Latin American, I think this is also the next big fight for our community, is to really deal and face the very deep anti-Blackness we have in the Latinx and the Latina community. We just have not properly acknowledged it and done our own healing. So I don't know, I'm probably going off on a tangent, but I do think ultimately it is about anti-Blackness. It is about white supremacy if we're really gonna make a dent in anything.
Yeah, let's actually dig in on that. I wanted to go there next, and thank you for naming it, Alex. Also want to encourage folks in the audience, if you have questions, feel free to use the YouTube comments or the question feature there. Would love to speak to any questions that are coming up for folks. But yeah, thank you for naming that, Alex. And combating anti-Blackness in our own communities is a paramount struggle. And I like the way that you put it, that's the next big struggle within our communities. So how How are you seeing that in the work that you do? How are you all taking that on? What types of groups do you see taking that on? Where are the areas of encouragement that you see? Where are the areas of challenges? Let's talk a little bit about work within our own communities, right? About combating colorism and anti-Blackness. What gives you hope? What encourages you about that work?
So, in what encourages me is my two granddaughters who are Black Latinas. One is 13 and the other is about to turn 10, who embrace both of their cultural identities and racial identities. And the fact that more of our families, Latinos are more likely to marry another race than many other groups. But I think the fact that Alex is mentioning it, that I know Hispanics in Philanthropy has a racial equity on all the work that it does. I think the fact that Nelson Colon and the Puerto Rico Community Foundation is putting together a racial equity institute for the Americas, because racism looks different in certain areas of the United States, and also, where there was slavery in Latin America. I think the focus on this issue, gives me hope. We have to start with ourselves, and racism is one of the issues. But machismo is also another issue. Misogyny runs deep. One of the articles in our book, If We Want to Win, is about domestic abuse. Our rates of domestic abuse are, through the roof. We have to come to terms with that. Like Alex said, we have to own that trauma. And one of the things that Anjanette Delgado talks about is precisely, the fact that that we have to talk about it. We can't just, pretend that it doesn't happen. Yeah. We have to talk about it. We have to bring it out, and we've got to do something.
I can step in.
Yeah.
Similarly, as Alex was talking about making long-run investments in systems change, what comes to mind is that this is not a moment like the Black moment. This has to be like a forever time. It can't be a blip. So these investments that we're talking about in terms of in our organizations have to be both right now and continuing. When we talk about centering BIPOC, it's Black, Indigenous, people of color. And so we have to start with that understanding that, yes, this country was built on the backs of Black people that were brought, obviously, involuntarily. The Smithsonian just had a couple of weeks ago also Indian slavery, a really amazing piece on that, recognizing, I think, is the first step of everything. And then there's really important work, and you don't have to invent it. There's the framework of awake to woke to work, and understanding that it's a whole circle, and that you have to do it yourself. Organizations have to do it as a system. Communities have to do this work. But what is the legacy that we have all lived in? And it's not that anybody is a bad person. We all have biases, and just understand that this is just something that is a constant thing. And so as an organization, we're doing that. We are working with and also funding other organizations that are living this work, and just being really honest and willing to be vulnerable. Willing to be vulnerable is something that very few of us are good at, but we have to get better at that.
Oh, that's really profound. For myself, I'm given hope by work that you see in Latin America that, to your point about BIPOC, like encompasses Afro-descendant and Indigenous leaders, right? Out of our Andean region and based in Bogota at the Ford Foundation. That's been a real focus of our work over the last several years, is Afro-descendant and Indigenous leaders. And they sort of get grouped together, that's the way they're understood in the political system, incorporated into the Constitution, and ensured representation politically. And so there are rich opportunities for understanding what that term intersectionality looks like in practice, a common experience of marginalization, but also of lifting up the leadership and the wisdom from within those communities.
Chris, we all have to be allies to each other, and we all have to stand together. And it's not, we have to get rid of this very European centric, like a pie that gets divided. And we just have to grow the pie and understand that we all really do need to stand together. It's just as simple as that. Mm-hmm. For Latinos, I mean, a quarter of our folks are Indigenous, a quarter of our folks self-identify as Black, if you look at the recent census numbers. So we are clearly multi-ethnic, multiracial, and that's at our core. And so, oops, did we lose you? And so that's
apologies.
Yeah, begin there.
Yeah, no, and that's the. And I'm sorry that I missed that for a little bit, but if what I heard, the multiracial reality of our communities, right? I've heard it said that a third of Latin Americans have African descent, so we need to start understanding that that dimension of our heritage and lifting that up within leadership within our own communities. Good. So we have a couple of questions from the audience. Talking about the threat to democracy that had been referenced earlier. Are you all aware of any efforts to strengthen commitment in Latina communities to democratic procedures that are under threat now from state-level voting restrictions? Right, so you see these bills at a state level that are restricting voting rights. Anything on your radar screen focusing particularly on engaging Latina communities in the pushback against those restrictions?
I mean, I'm a little familiar. The state I'm most familiar with.
So, Alex.
Oh, go ahead, Deanna.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to mention that the only state that I'm slightly aware of is Texas. I have some good friends who are the EDs of local education nonprofits there, and one of the big fights that Texas has been, facing is the elimination of ethnic studies. And for those of us in California, where this is kind of a given, and it's part of our curriculum here in the public school systems, it's shocking to think that another state with such a huge Latino population might be getting rid of such a core class. So that's what I'm aware of that fight, and there's a lot of great organizations in Texas that are organizing there. I wouldn't be surprised if Latina-led reproductive health organizations are gearing up and organizing with the latest the bill that was passed there that's made its way up to the Supreme Court. But that's really the only state I'm aware of. I'm absolutely certain that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of Latino-led nonprofits who are part of coalitions and gearing up. Mm-hmm. And we need to be investing in those groups. And I think the best source to get to those groups is probably through organizations like HIP. Or through local, community foundations who have a social justice mission, like the East Bay Community Foundation. Those are the two ways that I think we can best support those groups, unless you have direct access on the ground in your community.
Chris, I was going to add on to that. We have an initiative called Power Building and Justice, which we just launched earlier this year, and there's literally hundreds of grantees all across the country that is doing this kind of work. Texas and the big states that come to our attention as the states that have strong Latino communities and demographics. Florida, New York, make the road in New York. There's just so many. But there's so many in other states that we don't think about, like North Carolina and Georgia and Louisiana. All of these communities have very fast growing Latino populations. I think Georgia, last time I looked, is the state that has the fastest growing Latino community population. And so there's hundreds, they're all across the country. And I mean, I'm happy to go offline and share some of the list of organizations depending on what people want to learn. But it's important that we invest not just in the get out the vote and the educating, but in their infrastructure as well, because they can't do this for free. I think what we saw during COVID was really difficult because folks were both suffering the effects of COVID and the recession. So they were protagonists in this whole, like in everything that was happening, as well as frontline defenders and essential workers all at the same time. And how can a human being do that? And how can they do it with that when they're not getting paid a livable wage? So we really need to invest in that. Oftentimes people ask me that they want to invest in programs, but they want all of the money to go to direct, like the direct services. And I'm always pushing, you need to fund the indirect or admin costs are not a bad thing. That's how the community, that these organizations stay strong, are able to pay for benefits for their employees. And so that's really important when you're thinking about how to serve and how to make your donations stronger.
Yeah. Thank you. Deanna, you wanted to get in there.
And I did. And so I think, Naleo and Mi Familia Boda, very important. And then there are these groups like Presente.org and Mi Gente, which are reaching, the younger voters, and it's all social media and online. I think there's plenty of organizations. And the great thing about it is that by building this infrastructure, by supporting that new leadership, we're building impact for long haul. And to go back to our book, if we want to win, our vision for the decade is, that this group of Latino voters, the ones that are 18 to 24 now, all of them, but in particular, the ones that are 18 to 24 are a really powerful voting bloc. And we need to get their narrative out. We need to talk to them. We need to convince them that their vote and their organizing and their civic life is really important.
I have to get in there, Chris, because what Deanna says, I mean, a lot of what we're seeing in all of these elections, it's because of the Latino community got in there and voted or didn't get in there and vote. And so if we're not investing in tech, in social media, in mobile friendly, it's not going to work. We were investing in very high level, like relationship building and knocking on doors, but that's not the world as it is anymore. Our community is the most so digital oriented, especially the young people. And so whatever information you want to get, it needs to go in that direction, and it has to tick those boxes.
Great. Couple more questions before we wrap in the next few minutes. One from the audience. What thoughts do the panelists have about investing in public education, which schools the vast majority of Latina children? We haven't talked about education in this context, but where does investing in public education fit in this mosaic that we've been talking about?
That's the base for everything, not just for our Latino kids, but for all kids. We have to learn how to analyze what we're reading, to understand and to unpack and to ask critical questions. So have a democracy that's functioning, we need to have investment in education. And if we want to have a strong competitive workforce, we need to have education. I mean, that's key for me.
Yeah, and I would add that it's not just about investing in the direct service groups in the education space, but it's really, for me, the big fight is, at the state level across various states, and making the reforms necessary at the budget level so that we're actually investing properly. California is an amazing example. I think we're 45th in terms of per pupil spending, and which is, a travesty, and we should be ashamed of ourselves. We had the chance last year at the 2020 election to reform our current system that does limit, it ties public school funding to property taxes, residential property taxes. And we had a measure on the ballot that would have freed up billions for our California schools, and unfortunately it did not pass, but by a very small margin. So the groups are gearing up and preparing. And that was really possible, that the chance that the fact that we were so close at reforming, California, how we fund public schools in California, was a direct result of coalitions, multiracial coalitions, decades in the making, and funders like TCE and Cal Wellness who got in there and supported these coalitions. That's exactly what all these funders should be doing. Really being trusting the leadership of Latino and Black and other communities of color. And they were the ones that put together the agenda, the policy reforms that they wanted. And philanthropy kind of took the step back. But it was a big deal for philanthropy, in my view, to do that kind of C4 investments. We need to be doing more of it. And I think that's the way to improve education, is to really donors and foundations to get in there and and invest in those groups doing the policy reform.
Excellent. Well, thank you to the audience for these great questions. Before we officially wrap, it's a tradition here to ask all our speakers the following question, and we'll wrap on this. What is your 60-second idea to change the world? Diana, would you like to start?
My 60-second idea to change the world is for each one of us to ask ourselves, how humanity can improve, by really finding common cause and then changing that into social change strategies and moving forward.
Thank you. Alex.
This one's a little off the wall, but I'm going to go with therapy for everyone. I really do think that the world would look a lot different if people had the supports in place to really deal with their personal and their maybe intergenerational trauma. I think a lot of the issues we're facing are due to people not understanding who they are and not doing the necessary healing.
Thank you. Ana Mari.
Okay, I'm going to go with everyone using their power, their privilege, and their influence. We have so much of it, and most of it remains untapped. So call your local community foundation, call the corporations which you are so loyal to, and demand that they pay attention to these things and that they fund and invest in our communities in a way that reflects what our communities look like. I think about just like in the Latino community, if we were able to grow by 10% over the next 10 years, what we're currently getting, which is that 1% that I talked about earlier, we would grow the 500 million that's being given out nationally to Latino serving to, I think if I'm doing the math right, it's like 5 billion. What can we do with 5 billion? A whole lot of the work that we've been talking about. So it's exciting to me too.
Excellent.
Think about that.
Thank you, Diana Campoamor, Ana Maria Archilagos, and Alexandra Aquino-Fike for joining me today at Inforum at the Commonwealth Club. A reminder that if we want to win, A Latina Vision for a New American Democracy can be purchased through your preferred bookseller. If you'd like to watch more virtual programs or support the Commonwealth Club's efforts in making virtual programming, please visit commonwealthclub.org/online. I'm Chris Cardona. Thank you and take care.